The night was bright and full of life inside the Remington mansion. Golden light sparkled from the tall chandeliers that hung above a wide marble floor. The guests arrived in fancy cars, dressed in shining gowns and black tuxedos. Laughter filled the hall, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with the soft tunes of a small orchestra in the corner. It was one of those nights when the rich tried to outshine each other, showing off jewelry, smiles, and secrets behind polite words. Charles Remington, the millionaire host, stood near the grand staircase. His posture was proud, his expression confident. He was a man used to being admired. His dark suit fit perfectly, his silver hair neatly combed. People surrounded him, laughing at every joke he told, even when it wasn't funny. That was how they stayed in his good books, with flattery and fake smiles. Charles enjoyed the attention. For him, the night wasn't just about celebration. It was about reminding everyone who he was, powerful, wealthy, and above all, untouchable. While the guests danced and chatted, the servants moved quietly in the background. They carried trays of food, refilled drinks, and made sure everything looked perfect. Among them was a young maid named Elena. She wore a simple black and white uniform with a lace apron and white gloves. Her hair was neatly tied back and her eyes were soft but alert. She worked quickly, careful not to draw attention to herself. She knew her place, invisible among the shining guests. Elena had been working in the mansion for almost a year. Most of the time, no one noticed her except when they needed something. But tonight, she felt something strange in the air, a mix of excitement and tension. The guests seemed louder than usual, the laughter sharper. Maybe it was the wine. Or maybe it was because Charles loved to make every event grander than the last. He wanted people to talk about his parties for weeks. In the corner of the ballroom stood a shiny black grand piano. It was as polished as a mirror, its keys gleaming under the light. Charles had hired a professional pianist to perform during dinner, someone from the city known for charming the upper class with classical music. But behind the scenes there was a problem. The pianist had fallen sick just before the party and couldn't come. The head butler, Mr. Lewis, was pacing nervously in the hallway, whispering to the kitchen staff about what to do. "Mr. Remington won't be happy," one maid muttered. He wanted live music for the guests. Elena overheard them while setting down a tray of glasses. Her heart beat faster. She had played the piano once, a long time ago, before her life took a different turn. The thought of touching those keys again made her hands tremble slightly, but she didn't say anything. How could she? She was just a maid. Inside the ballroom, Charles noticed the silence that replaced the music. His sharp eyes turned toward the piano, then toward the butler. "Where is the pianist?" he asked loudly, his voice carrying across the room. The guests turned to look, curious. Mr. Lewis hurried over, bowing slightly. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," he whispered. "He's fallen ill. He won't be able to make it tonight." Charles frowned, his smile fading. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that my guests will sit here in silence?" His tone was cold, and the butler's hands began to shake. "No, sir, I'll find a solution," Mr. Lewis said quickly, though he had no idea what that solution would be. He rushed toward the servants' area, his face pale. Elena stood by the kitchen door, her thoughts racing. She remembered her mother's old piano, the way the notes used to echo in their small house. Music had once been her dream. Before poverty, before working as a maid, before everything changed. She took a deep breath and quietly followed Mr. Lewis into the corridor. "Sir?" she said softly. He turned, surprised to see her. "I can play," she said, her voice shaking slightly. If you'll allow me." He blinked at her. "You, the maid?" "Yes," she said. "I can play. I learned when I was young. Please let me help." "It's better than silence," Mr. Lewis hesitated. He knew Charles could be cruel if things went wrong, but he also knew the guests would start whispering if the music didn't return soon. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "But if this goes badly—" "I understand," Elena said, her heart pounding. As she walked back toward the ballroom, she could feel the weight of 100 eyes waiting for entertainment. The air was thick with perfume and judgment. Charles stood near the piano, his glass of wine in hand, watching her with a smirk of disbelief. "What's this?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is the maid going to play for us now?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Elena felt her face warm, but she didn't look down. She moved toward the piano, her steps steady, her white gloves gleaming in the light. The guests began whispering to each other. Some were curious, others amused. A few shook their heads, expecting a disaster. To them, this was just a small joke, something to talk about later over dessert. But for Elena, it was something else entirely. As she sat on the piano bench, her reflection shimmered on the polished black surface. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The laughter faded, the light softened, and she closed her eyes. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, the same way she used to as a little girl, and took one deep breath. In that silent second, before the first note was played, no one knew that the maid they ignored every day was about to change everything. Elena's heart was racing as she walked toward the grand piano. The sound of her shoes clicking on the marble floor echoed softly, but to her it felt deafening. Every pair of eyes followed her, curious, judging, whispering. The glow of the chandeliers shimmered above her, almost too bright, making the room feel warmer than before. The guests stood in colorful gowns and dark suits, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief. A maid at their piano? It was unheard of. Mr. Lewis, the butler, followed close behind, his face tight with worry. He leaned in and whispered, "Play something gentle, please. Just do your best." Elena nodded, her hands trembling slightly. She sat down, straightened her posture, and looked at the black and white keys in front of her. They looked the same as they did years ago when she used to play as a child, familiar yet distant, like an old friend she hadn't spoken to in a long time. From across the room, Charles Remington watched her with a smirk. He sipped his wine and said loudly, "Well, this should be entertaining. Let's see what our maid can do." His guests chuckled, some covering their mouths to hide their laughter. Elena heard it, but she didn't let it break her focus. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys, feeling the smooth surface under her gloves. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered her mother's face, soft, kind, encouraging her to keep practicing even when their old piano was missing half its keys. "Music is the only place where the soul speaks freely," her mother used to say. That memory gave Elena courage. When she opened her eyes again, she took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes were gentle, uncertain, like the first words of a shy conversation. Then slowly they grew stronger, fuller, richer. The melody filled the grand hall, flowing through the air like a soft wind through open windows. The guests stopped whispering. Their laughter faded, replaced by silence and awe. The tune she played was not from any famous composer. It was something she had written herself years ago, a melody born from longing and hope. It told the story of a young girl who had dreams too big for the world she lived in. Each note carried a piece of her past, the joy, the loss, the hunger to rise above her struggles. The piano responded beautifully, its sound deep and smooth. The candlelight danced on its polished surface, and Elena's reflection shimmered faintly as her hands moved gracefully across the keys. Her face softened, her eyes glowing with quiet passion. Charles leaned forward in his seat, his confident grin slowly fading. He hadn't expected this, not from a servant, not from someone he barely noticed before tonight. Around him, his guests stood still, their fans and glasses frozen mid-air. The music had a strange power. It pulled at something inside them, something they hadn't felt in a long time. As she played, Elena forgot where she was. The grand ballroom, the judgmental eyes, even Charles himself, all disappeared. In her mind, she was back in her mother's little house, the sun pouring through the curtains, the scent of bread baking in the kitchen. For a few minutes, she was free. When the song reached its middle, her playing became more intense. Her fingers moved faster, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The melody rose like a wave, full of strength and emotion. It was as if every pain she had ever buried deep inside her was now being released through the piano. Tears began to form in the eyes of some of the guests. They couldn't explain why, but the music touched them. It reminded them of something real, something beyond money, beyond appearances. Even Mr. Lewis, standing in the corner, wiped his eyes quietly. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt small. The woman he had mocked now held the entire room in her hands, not with power or wealth, but with truth. He looked around and saw his guests staring at her with admiration, not at him, not at his wealth. It stung his pride, not at his wealth. It stung his pride. Elena reached the final part of her piece. The notes grew softer again, like the calm after a storm. The last few keys she pressed lingered in the air, fading slowly, gently, until the sound disappeared completely. Then for a heartbeat, there was silence. A silence so deep it felt sacred. And then the applause began. It started with one pair of hands, then another. Then the entire room erupted into clapping and cheers. Some guests even shouted, "Bravo!" as they wiped their eyes. The sound of their appreciation filled the room more powerfully than the music had moments before. Elena looked up, startled by their reaction. She smiled shyly and stood, bowing slightly. Her cheeks glowed not from pride but from pure relief and joy. She had done what she loved, and that was enough. Mr. Lewis clapped too, grinning proudly. He whispered, "Well done, my dear." "Well done." Charles remained seated for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally he clapped, slowly, stiffly, but his eyes avoided hers. For once he had nothing clever to say. Elena turned and quietly left the piano. As she walked back toward the servants' door, the guests continued to applaud. Some called out her name, asking her to play again, but she only smiled and shook her head. Behind her, the music still seemed to linger in the air as if refusing to leave. It had changed the room, and maybe, just maybe, changed a few hearts inside it. And though she disappeared into the quiet hallway once again, everyone knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The night when a maid's song silenced the proud. The sound of applause still echoed softly through the hall as Elena lowered her eyes, trying to hide the small smile that had formed on her lips. For the first time in a long while she had felt alive. But before she could leave, Charles Remington's sharp voice cut through the crowd. "Well," he said, standing up with a glass of wine in his hand. That was unexpected. Everyone turned toward him. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a hint of mockery that made Elena's chest tighten. He walked closer to the piano, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. The guests watched silently, unsure whether to smile or stay quiet. "You play beautifully," he said with a smirk. For someone who spends her days polishing floors and dusting shelves. A few people chuckled nervously. Elena stood still, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't know what to say. She had expected silence or maybe polite thanks. Not this. Charles circled the piano slowly, like a cat studying its prey. "Tell me," he continued, where did you learn to play like that? Did the servants' school have a music class now?" The laughter grew louder this time. The bright chandeliers glowed above, but to Elena the room suddenly felt darker. The applause she had earned moments ago had turned into quiet humiliation. Mr. Lewis, the butler, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, with respect," Charles raised a hand, stopping him. No, I'm curious," he said. "It's not every day we discover such hidden talent in the cleaning staff. Perhaps she should perform at all our parties. Maybe she'll play while serving dinner next time." The crowd laughed again. Elena's heart sank, but she forced herself to stay calm. Her cheeks burned, yet she stood straight. She had seen cruelty before, and the kind that hides behind polite smiles. "I only wanted to help, sir," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't drop. Charles tilted his head. "Help?" he said, amused. "You think you were helping? You embarrassed my guests. This is supposed to be a formal event, not a street performance." One of the women in a pink gown stepped forward. "Oh, come now, Charles," she said softly. "She played beautifully." Everyone loved it. He turned toward her, his expression hard. "Yes, perhaps too beautifully," he said. "People are starting to talk more about the maid than the host." "That's not exactly what I planned." The woman fell silent. Elena looked at him, realizing the truth behind his cruelty. He wasn't angry because she played badly. He was angry because she had shone brighter than he expected. Her music had stolen his spotlight, even if only for a moment. She didn't reply. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble, sir," she said softly. "That was never my intention," Charles smirked. "Of course not. You're just doing your job, aren't you?" He took a slow sip of wine, then set the glass down on the piano. "Tell me something, Elena," he said, leaning closer. "Do you really think you belong here? Among these people?" The question hung in the air like a knife. Elena looked at the piano, the instrument that had given her a brief moment of freedom, and then at the crowd. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched, waiting to see if she would break. "No," she said quietly. "I don't belong here, but for a few minutes I felt like I did, and that was enough." Her answer caught him off guard. For a moment he didn't speak. Then, forcing a smile, he clapped his hands twice. "Well, that's touching," he said sarcastically. You hear that, everyone? The maid has dreams. How poetic. The laughter started again, though weaker now. It was clear that not everyone found it funny anymore. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. A few even frowned at Charles, realizing he had gone too far. Elena turned to leave, her eyes glistening but her steps steady. Each step she took echoed like a quiet statement, proud, defiant, unbroken. She reached the door, her hand trembling slightly on the handle, but before she could step out, she heard a voice. "Wait," said an older gentleman near the front. His silver hair glowed under the chandelier. That was one of the finest performances I've ever heard. "You have a gift, young lady. Don't let anyone make you feel small for it." The crowd turned toward him, surprised. He was one of the most respected guests, a composer who had once written music for royal concerts. Charles's jaw tightened. Elena looked back, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she said. The man nodded. "Talent doesn't care about wealth or title," he said firmly. "It only cares about heart." The room went silent. Even Charles didn't reply. He simply turned away, his face hard and unreadable. Elena bowed slightly to the composer and left through the servants' door. As she walked down the quiet corridor, she could still hear faint murmurs behind her, but this time they weren't laughing. They were whispering about her, the maid who played like an angel, the girl who stood her ground. She stopped for a moment near a window, looking out at the moonlight falling over the garden. The night felt calm again. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Maybe I don't belong there, but my music does." And somewhere behind her, in the grand ballroom filled with golden pride, a man named Charles Remington stood staring at the piano, realizing, for the first time, that he had been silenced not by status, but by a song. The moment Elena sat back down at the piano, the room seemed to shrink into silence again. The laughter, the chatter, even the soft clinking of glasses and everything faded away. Only the faint hum of candle flames and the sound of her steady breathing remained. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the sting of Charles's words that still echoed in her mind. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. For a second, doubt crept in. She could feel every eye in the ballroom fixed on her, some waiting for her to fail, others quietly hoping she wouldn't. Then she remembered something her mother once told her long ago. When people try to silence your heart, let your heart speak louder. So she began to play. The first notes were soft, gentle, like whispers of forgiveness. The melody floated into the air, delicate but certain, wrapping around the golden pillars and echoing off the marble floors. Slowly, the music grew stronger, not loud but confident, and filled the entire hall like warm sunlight spilling into a cold room. Every note she played carried a piece of her soul. It wasn't just sound. It was emotion. The tune told a story, her story. It spoke of long days of work, of wiping tables and washing floors while dreaming of something more. It spoke of loneliness, of hunger, of nights when she had to choose between sleep and tears. But it also spoke of hope, bright, glowing hope that refused to die even when the world turned its back on her. People listened in stunned silence. The same guests who had laughed minutes ago now stood still, their faces softening. The woman in the pink gown pressed her hand to her chest. A man near the corner closed his eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Even the servers standing along the walls forgot their duties for a moment, drawn in by the beauty of the sound. Elena's hands moved gracefully, faster now, each key ringing clear and true. The piano seemed alive under her touch, answering her emotions with perfect harmony. The song rose like a wave, powerful, emotional, unstoppable, then fell again into calm, gentle ripples. Charles sat in his chair, motionless. His smirk had vanished. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention and he didn't know how to handle it. The music hit him in a way he couldn't explain. He wanted to scoff, to interrupt, but he couldn't. Something about that melody pierced right through his arrogance and reached the part of him he had long buried, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be moved by something pure. Elena, lost in her music, no longer saw him. Her eyes were half closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. A soft smile touched her lips, not one of pride, but of peace. She wasn't playing for them anymore. She was playing for herself. The lights from the chandelier danced across her face, highlighting the quiet joy in her. Chandelier danced across her face, highlighting the quiet joy in her. expression. The golden glow reflected in her eyes made her look almost otherworldly, as if she belonged to the music itself. Then came a shift. The melody deepened, turning bittersweet. It spoke of longing, of dreams that once lived, but were lost along the way. The notes trembled with emotion, pain mixed with beauty. Some guests began to tear up without even knowing why. It was as if her song had opened something inside them, a memory, a regret, a truth they hadn't faced. The older composer who had defended her earlier stood quietly near the front, his hands clasped. His eyes were full of admiration. "Extraordinary," he whispered to himself. As the song reached its final passage, Elena slowed her pace. The room felt suspended in time, no one daring to move or breathe too loudly. Her fingers pressed the last few keys, soft, tender notes that faded into the still air like falling feathers. Then, silence. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. No one spoke. No one even clapped. They were too stunned, too caught between disbelief and wonder. The silence itself became a part of her music, a quiet echo of what she had created. Then came the first clap, gentle, hesitant. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, the sound growing louder, stronger, until it filled the hall with thunderous appreciation. People were smiling, some crying, some shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Elena lifted her head slowly, her cheeks flushed. She stood and gave a small bow. Her heart raced, but not from fear this time, from joy. She had done what she loved most, and she had done it her way. Charles, still seated, finally joined in the applause. His hands moved slowly, his expression unreadable. But deep down he knew something had shifted, not just in the room, but inside himself. The maid he had mocked had done something he, with all his money and power, could never do. She had moved people's hearts. When the applause finally faded, the composer approached her. "That was no ordinary performance," he said gently. "That was truth in music." Elena smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir," she said. "It's all I had to give." He nodded with warmth. And it was more than enough. As she stepped away from the piano, the guests parted for her to pass. Some even nodded respectfully, offering small smiles. She had entered the ballroom as a servant, invisible and ordinary, but she was leaving as something else entirely. Behind her, the grand piano stood quietly, the light glinting off its polished surface. The notes she had played seemed to linger in the air, invisible but alive, like a memory that refused to fade. And for the first time that night, even Charles Remington, the proud millionaire, looked small in his own house. The woman he tried to humiliate had just filled his world with beauty he could never buy. Elena's music lingered in the air long after her fingers left the piano keys. The room was still, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted the moment to end. That melody had reached into every corner of the ballroom, every heart, and brought out something deeply human that no amount of wealth or power could hide. As the applause faded, Elena sat for a moment, lost in thought. What she had played wasn't just a song, it was her life turned into sound. Each note had been a memory, and each chord had carried a piece of her past that words could never explain. When she was a little girl, her family didn't have much. They lived in a small town where the streets turned muddy when it rained, and their home smelled faintly of bread and dust. But they had an old piano, scratched, slightly out of tune, yet magical in its own way. Her mother used to sit beside her, guiding her small hands across the keys, humming along to the melodies she learned. "Don't play to impress," her mother would say. "Play to feel." Those words had never left her. Even now, sitting in a golden hall surrounded by people far richer than she'd ever be, she still played for the same reason, to feel alive. Her memories floated through her mind like scenes from another world. She remembered sitting at that old piano as a storm raged outside, her mother's voice blending with the sound of rain. She remembered the day her father lost his job and sold the piano to pay rent. She had cried for hours, her heart breaking, as strangers carried away the only thing that made her world colorful. That was the day she promised herself she would play again someday, even if life took everything else away. But life was never kind. Years later, her mother passed away, and Elena moved to the city looking for work. She found herself scrubbing floors, carrying trays, and being treated as though she were invisible. Every day she passed by rooms where people played music, pianos, violins, string quartets, and each time she would stop for a moment, listening quietly from the doorway before moving on. Music had once been her dream, but now it was a memory she carried like a small flame in her heart. Tonight that flame had burst into fire again. The melody she had played was born from all those moments. The laughter, the pain, the hunger, and the love that never left her. It was as if, through the piano, she had told her entire story without saying a single word. In the crowd, people still felt the weight of that truth. The woman in the pink gown who had once laughed along with Charles now wiped tears from her eyes. The older composer leaned on his cane, whispering softly to himself, "There's honesty in that girl's hands." Even the younger guests who came for gossip and champagne felt something they didn't expect: humility. Charles Remington, however, sat silently. His glass of wine was untouched. His jaw tightened as he replayed the sound of her music in his mind. It unsettled him. He couldn't understand why a few simple notes could make him feel so small. All his life, he had believed that power came from money, control, and reputation. Yet this maid, this quiet girl, had silenced him with nothing but emotion. He remembered mocking her earlier, the way the crowd laughed. For the first time, he wished he hadn't. Elena stood slowly, giving a small nod to the guests. She wasn't proud. She was grateful. It wasn't applause she wanted. It was peace. For years she had hidden her music like a secret, afraid it no longer belonged to her. But tonight she had taken it back. As she turned to leave, her reflection shimmered faintly on the piano's surface. For a brief moment, she imagined her mother's face smiling back at her. The thought filled her eyes with quiet tears, not of sadness but of release. Outside the ballroom, the night was calm. She stepped into the corridor, away from the lights and noise. Her hands still tingled from the music, and her heart beat softly in rhythm with the memory of her song. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes, whispering, "You would have liked that, Mama." Back inside, the guests began to speak again, their voices hushed as if afraid to break the spell she had left behind. Some called it talent. Others said it was divine, but none of them truly understood. It wasn't perfection that had moved them, it was truth. The melody had stirred something inside everyone who heard it. It reminded them of what it felt like to be human, to feel joy and pain, to lose and still hope again. That night, no one remembered the expensive food or the fancy wine. What they remembered was the maid who played from her heart, and how her music made them feel things they'd forgotten long ago. Elena didn't know what her song had done to the people inside that hall. She didn't know that her music had reached even the cold heart of Charles Remington. She simply walked back to her small room in the servants' quarters, humming softly to herself, smiling at the memory of her mother's words. For her, it wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about pride or revenge. It was about remembering who she truly was, a girl who once dreamed, and who for one night dared to dream again. And in that moment, the maid who had once been invisible had become unforgettable. The ballroom had changed. It was the same golden hall, the same chandeliers, the same people. Yet everything felt different. The air that once carried laughter and gossip now felt heavy with quiet awe. It was as if Elena's music had swept through and gently erased all the pride, noise, and judgment that had filled the room earlier. For a moment, no one moved. The guests just stood there, their eyes still fixed on the piano where the maid had performed. It didn't matter that she wore a plain uniform or that her gloves were slightly worn. What they remembered now wasn't what she looked like. It was what they felt. The woman in the pink gown, who had laughed earlier when Charles made his cruel jokes, wiped her eyes quickly before anyone could see. The older composer stood by the piano, deep in thought, as if trying to memorize the sound that had just filled the room. A young couple whispered softly to each other, their smiles small but genuine, touched by something they couldn't quite explain. Even the servants watching from the shadows felt proud. They had seen Elena every day, the quiet girl who always worked hard, never complained, and sometimes hummed softly while cleaning the hall. But tonight she had shown them that being unseen didn't mean being unworthy. Then came the slow sound of clapping, one pair of hands, then another, until applause filled the room again, not out of politeness this time, but out of pure admiration. People looked at Elena with respect now, not pity or amusement. Some even nodded to her as if acknowledging something greater than talent. Courage. Charles Remington sat in his chair silent. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. He had spent his life buying admiration, through wealth, through grand parties, through power. Yet in one evening a maid had earned it without asking, without trying. The sound of applause that had once always belonged to him was now hers. Inside something twisted in him, a mix of shame and anger. He couldn't understand how someone so ordinary could make people feel more than he ever had. It was as though she had stolen his spotlight, not with pride but with honesty. He stood up slowly, his glass of wine untouched. The room quieted again. Everyone turned toward him, waiting to see what he would say. His reputation was built on confidence and charm, but now both seemed to have abandoned him. Well, he began, his voice calm but strained. It seems our maid has found a new calling. His attempt at humor fell flat. No one laughed this time. The guests looked uncomfortable. A few even frowned. The shift in the room was clear. They were no longer on his side. The power he once commanded with his words had vanished. Elena turned to face him. Her face was calm, her eyes steady. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The same man who had mocked her earlier now looked small. Not because she had humiliated him, but because she had risen above it with grace. The composer stepped forward and said, "Mr. Remington, I believe tonight's finest moment came from the most unexpected place. You should be proud that your home witnessed such beauty." Charles forced a smile. "Of course," he replied, but the warmth in his tone was gone. He gave a small nod to Elena. "Well done," he added, though it sounded more like surrender than praise. The applause started again, louder this time. People turned back to Elena, ignoring the millionaire completely. Some clapped until their hands turned red. Others simply smiled, still moved by what they had heard. As the crowd continued, Elena bowed her head politely. Her cheeks were slightly red and her eyes glowed softly under the chandelier's golden light. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she handled it with quiet dignity. The servants at the back whispered to each other proudly. "That's our Elena," one of them said with a grin. "Did you hear her play?" "She was amazing," another replied. "Never seen Mr. Remington so quiet before." When the applause finally faded, people began to talk again. Not about business or luxury or rumors, but about her. The melody had connected them in a way no grand party ever could. Strangers spoke kindly to one another, their voices soft, as if afraid to disturb the peace her music had left behind. And for the first time in many years, the Remington mansion felt human. Elena stood by the piano, her heart still fluttering, unsure whether to smile or cry. She had never imagined that something she thought was lost forever could change an entire room. She looked down at her gloved hands, the same hands that scrubbed floors and polished silverware every day, and she realized something. Those hands could also create beauty. As she quietly left the stage, people stepped aside to make room for her. A few guests reached out to shake her hand. One woman whispered, "You have a gift, dear. Don't ever let it go." Elena nodded with a humble smile. "Thank you," she said softly. When she passed by Charles, he avoided her eyes. For once, he had no witty remark, no arrogance left to hide behind. He simply stared at the floor, his pride cracked like glass. Outside the ballroom, the faint sound of laughter returned. But it was different now, lighter, warmer, more genuine. The shift in the room was complete. What began as a night of vanity had turned into a night of humility. And at the center of it all was a maid who had done the impossible. She had silenced the proud, softened the cold, and reminded everyone that sometimes greatness comes dressed in the simplest clothes. The ballroom roared with applause once again, louder than before, almost thunderous. People clapped until their palms hurt, some even shouting words of praise. "Bravo! Magnificent! Incredible!" The air was filled with warmth and admiration, the kind that couldn't be faked. Elena stood beside the piano, her hands trembling slightly. Her heart was still racing, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from pure, quiet joy. She had done what she came to do, not to impress, not to prove anyone wrong, but to share a part of her soul that had been hidden for so long, and somehow that simple act had changed everything. The woman in the pink gown walked up to her, eyes shining. "You were wonderful, my dear," she said softly. "You made me remember what real beauty feels like." "Thank you," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." Around the room, conversations began to bloom again, but this time they weren't shallow or boastful. Guests spoke gently with genuine emotion. Some even looked embarrassed, as if ashamed of how they had laughed earlier. The entire atmosphere had shifted. The glittering hall that once sparkled with pride now glowed with humanity. The older composer approached next, leaning slightly on his cane. His eyes were soft and kind. "That wasn't just music," he said with a faint smile. "That was life. Every note carried truth." Elena bowed her head, humbled. "Thank you, sir. I only played what I felt." He nodded approvingly. "And that's why it was perfect. Don't ever stop feeling." A few guests began gathering around, asking where she had learned to play, who had taught her, if she had performed anywhere else. Elena answered politely, though shyly, her cheeks warm, her heart fluttering. For years she had felt invisible in that house. Now suddenly everyone saw her, and then slowly, the sound of clapping faded again as Charles Remington rose from his seat. The crowd turned toward him, expecting one of his usual grand speeches, the kind that made everyone laugh and cheer. But tonight his face was different. The confidence in his smile had vanished. He looked older somehow, quieter. He cleared his throat. "Well," he began, trying to sound casual, "I must admit, I didn't expect that." The room stayed silent. Charles forced a smile and looked at Elena. "You play well," he said, though his tone lacked warmth. "Very moving. I think you've surprised us all." Elena met his gaze calmly. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "I only wanted to help." Something in her voice struck him. Not pride, not defiance, just honesty. And that made him feel even smaller. He looked around the room, realizing that everyone's attention was still on her, not him. For a man who lived on admiration, that realization cut deep. He laughed awkwardly. "Well, I suppose the lesson here is never underestimate your staff," he said. It was meant as a joke, but no one laughed. The guests only exchanged quiet glances. His attempt to reclaim the moment fell flat. Elena didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her calm silence was more powerful than any words could have been. The composer stepped closer, breaking the uncomfortable stillness. "No, Mr. Remington," he said gently. "The lesson here is that true grace doesn't wear silk or diamonds. Sometimes it wears an apron." A soft murmur spread through the room. Charles's smile disappeared completely. He gave a tight nod and sat down again, defeated. The applause began once more, this time directed fully at Elena. She bowed lightly, her eyes glistening. It wasn't just applause anymore. It was respect. People were no longer clapping for entertainment. They were clapping for courage, for truth, for humility. Elena stepped back, taking one last look at the grand piano. Its black surface reflected the lights, and for a brief moment she saw herself not as a maid, but as a musician, as the person she once dreamed of being. Her chest swelled with emotion. She didn't need trophies or fame. This moment was enough. As she turned to leave, the guests made way for her, parting like a wave. Some reached out to touch her arm or offer a kind word. The same people who hadn't looked at her twice before were now moved by the very soul they had ignored. At the doorway she paused and looked back one last time. The hall shimmered in gold, and all those eyes that had once looked down on her now watched her with awe. For the first time in her life she wasn't invisible. Charles sat in silence, his hands gripping his glass tightly. He stared at the floor, lost in thought. The noise of applause felt like thunder in his ears. Each clap a reminder that respect couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. For a man who had spent his life demanding admiration, He had just been taught the hardest lesson of all, humility. Elena left the room quietly, her steps soft and steady. She didn't look back again. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin. The stars above seemed brighter, as if celebrating her victory in their own silent way. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Mama, I did it." In that single moment, all the humiliation, all the hard days, all the loneliness seemed worth it. She had played not for them, but for her own heart, and that had been enough to change everything. Inside the ballroom, people were still talking about her. The maid who played like a dream, who silenced pride with grace and made even the coldest heart feel again. And in a quiet corner, Charles Remington sat alone, staring at the piano, his reflection. Remington sat alone, staring at the piano, his reflection, trembling on its shiny surface. He had spent years trying to be remembered for his wealth, but tonight everyone would remember her. Elena walked down the long, quiet hallway of the mansion, away from the golden lights, the perfume, and the noise of applause that still echoed faintly behind her. The marble floors reflected her soft steps, and her reflection looked back at her, tired but peaceful. The air outside the ballroom felt cooler, gentler, almost like the world itself was congratulating her in silence. She could still hear bits of laughter and talking from the guests as she passed the doorway. But this time it wasn't cruel or mocking. It was light, full of wonder, the kind that comes after something beautiful. People were still speaking about her, repeating her name with admiration. It didn't matter to her. She didn't crave fame or praise. What mattered was that she had finally played again, freely, honestly, with her heart open. She stopped by a large window overlooking the garden. The moonlight poured in, soft and silver, brushing against her face. She leaned on the window frame, closed her eyes, and took a slow, deep breath. The cool air smelled of roses and rain. It felt real, more real than the golden chandeliers behind her. In her heart she felt light, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. For years she had carried the sadness of lost dreams. For years she had believed her music no longer belonged anywhere. But tonight she proved herself wrong. The world had listened, not because of her title or status, but because of her truth. She smiled quietly. "Mama," she whispered to herself, "I played again, just like you wanted." Down the hall, the other servants peeked out from behind the kitchen door, their faces bright with pride. "You were amazing, Elena," one of them whispered excitedly. "Mr. Lewis said the guests are still talking about you." Elena laughed softly. "Oh, I don't think they'll remember me for long," she said modestly. But she was wrong. Back in the ballroom, Charles Remington sat in silence, staring at the piano. Around him, guests were still talking about the performance, the maid who played like a professional, the music that touched their souls, the moment when the mighty Charles Remington had nothing to say. For once, his name wasn't the center of the evening. Hers was. Charles took a slow sip of his wine, his reflection trembling in the red liquid. He couldn't stop hearing the melody in his head. It wasn't just music anymore, it was a mirror. Each note reminded him of the arrogance he had carried, the emptiness behind all his wealth. He realized that his house, no matter how grand, had never felt so alive until that maid sat at his piano. The composer approached him quietly. "A fine night, Mr. Remington," he said kindly. "One you'll never forget." Charles looked up, forcing a weak smile. "Yes," he said softly. "I suppose I won't." The composer studied him for a moment before adding, "Sometimes greatness arrives from the most unexpected hands." "You'd be wise to remember that." Charles said nothing. He only nodded, staring at the black piano shining under the chandelier. For the first time in his life he felt small, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that made him think. Meanwhile, Elena returned to her small room at the back of the mansion, a simple, quiet space with pale walls, a narrow bed, and a small wooden table. She sat on the edge of the bed, removing her white gloves slowly. Her fingers still tingled, the echo of the music still alive in them. She smiled faintly and whispered, "It was worth it." On the little table sat an old photograph, her mother, smiling beside a worn-out piano. Elena traced the edge of the picture gently. "You always said music could touch hearts," she said softly. "You were right." Outside, the wind brushed against the window pane, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the ballroom. But to Elena, the night was silent and perfect. She had no riches, no fame, and yet she felt wealthier than anyone in that mansion. In that quiet moment, she realized something powerful. Happiness doesn't come from where you stand in the world, but from what you carry inside you. And she carried music, pure, honest, and unbreakable. She lay down on her bed staring at the ceiling. The moonlight slipped through the curtains, painting silver patterns across her face. Her eyes grew heavy, but her heart was wide awake. Back in the ballroom, guests began leaving, still talking about the performance. She played like an angel, one woman said. It was as if the music spoke. Another added softly, I'll never forget the look on her face. It was peace, pure peace. And long after the lights dimmed, the memory of that night lingered in everyone's mind. Days turned into weeks, but the story spread quietly through the city. People spoke about the maid who silenced the millionaire. Some told it as gossip, others as inspiration. And though no one knew where she came from or where she learned to play, everyone agreed on one thing. Her music had been real. Charles never hosted another grand party quite like that again. The next time he passed the piano, he paused, staring at its keys, remembering her hands moving gracefully across them. Somewhere deep inside, something in him had changed. Pride had softened, and in its place grew a strange kind of respect, the kind that money couldn't buy. As for Elena, she continued her work quietly, never asking for recognition. Sometimes, when the mansion was empty, she'd sit by the piano again, playing softly to herself. Not for the guests, not for the applause, just for the music, for her heart, for her mother. And every time she played, the house seemed to glow a little brighter, as if remembering the night when a maid reminded the world that true greatness doesn't wear gold, it shines from within. That was her quiet triumph. She hadn't needed to shout or prove or demand respect. She had simply been herself, kind, humble, and unafraid to let her heart speak. And that was enough to silence everyone who had ever looked down on her, because sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that speaks without a single word. Without a single word.